In a world growing ever more connected, you'd think it would be in nations' best interests to try and hold on to whatever land or populations that they have under their grasp, in particular waning empires. As a result, it's quite common for a lot of people to want to seek independence or form their own country. However, it's extremely rare for someone to be kicked out of a country, and that is exactly what happened to Singapore. And no, it's not because they failed to pay the rent on time. Hello! Welcome to Brain Spill, the laziest show on the internet. My name is Tank, and today we're talking about that time that Singapore got kicked out of Malaysia. So what led up to this, and why did they decide to take such drastic action? I mean, if you think about many countries, there's always a certain section of the populace that the vast majority might not be that keen on, but they put up with them just because at the end of the day, it's better to have something rather than nothing. Looking at you, Florida. So this instance of a state being effectively booted out of a country is quite rare. And when we're looking at comparing Singapore and Malaysia, this is Malaysia and this is Singapore. As you can tell, there is a stark difference between the two of them. Singapore is very small in comparison, however it is extremely politically and economically influential in the area. Which makes this story all the more strange, but I think we're jumping the gun a little bit here. We need to rewind a little bit. Prior to the Second World War, this part of the world was controlled largely by the European powers, including that, of course, the British. In particular, in Southeast Asia. This had been the norm for over 100 years until the Second World War, when, Europe got a little bit preoccupied with other things, which gave Imperial Japan the perfect opportunity to sweep up many of these island states. Although Japan had come in and pretty much taken over a lot of Southeast Asia, they weren't actually under direct control of Japan as such. A lot of these states and countries had their own affairs and they were able to govern themselves, which was great. And once the Second World War came to an end, and of course the collapse of the Japanese Empire, a lot of the European powers came back to try and reclaim their old territories. However, a lot had changed during the war, and that is no different for Malaysia, who turned around and weren't too keen on the fact that their old occupiers were coming back to reclaim what was once theirs. As empires diminished, the colonies gained independence, many of which opted to join the newly formed Malaysia shortly after the war ended. This would be known as the proclamation of the formation of the Federation of Malaysia. However, even before this happened, there was already division amongst leaders who were mindful of the political and economic difference between the different states, in particular that of Singapore. Despite these differences, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew signed the Malaysia Agreement in London on the 9th of July 1963. The agreement spelt out the terms for the formation of the Federation of Malaysia, comprising of Singapore, Malaya, Sarawak and North Borneo, which was to take place on the 31st of August 1963. So, what this agreement effectively did was it outlined the autonomy that Singapore was granted under the agreement, and it also gave an outline as to how the federal government worked. In addition, it also outlined the responsibilities that Singapore had to the rest of Malaysia. This was all because of the different objectives behind the union. On the large, it was done to try and refute any attempt of communism coming to the region. But for Singapore, this was more business focused than it was for any security or political tension. It's easy to say that we may have jumped the gun talking about this and why Singapore was eventually booted out of Malaysia, but even from the very start, problems started to brew. And anyone with any foresight could probably have seen the writing on the wall. Like an old married couple, except they literally just formed a union, but the same still applies. These political and economic differences was brought to bear when Malaysia operated on a system called Malaysian Malaysia. This affirmative action was used to provide special quotas for the Malay and other indigenous peoples of Malaysia in admission to the public service, awarding of public scholarships, admission to public education institutions, and the awarding of various trade licenses. This basically started to unfairly discriminate against anyone else in the region. Any policy based on race was doomed from the start. This is basically a system which discriminated against anyone who was not ethnically Malaysian. an idea promoted by the ruling party of Singapore at the time. The People's Action Party of Singapore was a critic of such a policy, which would drive a wedge between them and the United Malays National Party for Malaysia, or the UMNM. Another cause for political tension came from the fact that the central government for the country was based in a region named Kuala Lumpur. But they feared that if they gave Singapore too much autonomy, they would soon become more significant in the country and effectively become its capital. They started acting against Singapore's best interests to make sure that this reality didn't happen. I mean, anyone that gets hitched should probably see this coming. I mean, someone's got to take the marital name at the end of the day. Unless it's double-barreled, but in this case, Malaysia firmly wanted to make sure that they didn't let Singapore get too out of control here. Safe to say, these differences pissed off both sides. And despite the People's Action Party in Singapore running in the federal election of 1964 against the ruling party, they had chosen to run despite previously promising they wouldn't, which, again, pissed off a lot of people. Now, the People's Action Party were running on a platform where they effectively wanted to end the Malaysian Malaysia policy, which effectively was them saying that there shouldn't be a policy based on race. And this was not in the interests of the ruling party. No, of course it wasn't. The People's Action Party had previously only won a fraction of the votes. However, with a platform like this was quite beneficial for the fairly large Chinese population that were living in Malaysia at the time. So if their platform was based on an anti-racial position, the ruling party feared that this may swing it against their favour. So in order to stop that from happening, they just decided to take action before that even became a reality. This all came to a head when a number of race riots broke out in Singapore, with the large ethnic Chinese population and the clear differences between Malaysia and the much smaller Singapore. The Prime Minister, Tunku Abdul Rahman, had to take some pretty significant action to stop the bloodshed. This wasn't all clear-cut, because there was a lot of people that actually wanted to remain part of Malaysia, and for Singapore to remain a state. However, with the growing tensions and the clear differences that were forming, it was eventually decided that a vote to effectively kick them out of Malaysia might be the best thing to do. The vote was undertaken by the Parliament of Malaysia as to whether Singapore should be expelled from the Union. However, Singapore were not present at this meeting. The vote occurred on the 9th of August 1965, with an overwhelming vote of 126-0 to expel Singapore. And, well, that was a pretty bloody decisive vote. On this day, the representatives of Singapore had to pretty much reluctantly accept their own independence, which is very strange to say because you'd imagine a lot of countries out there who were absolutely joyous and jubilant that they would get their own independence. Singapore was not one of them. The then senior politician in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, would then assume the role of Prime Minister, who declared independence in a very sobering fashion. You see, this is a moment of... Every time we look back on this moment, when we signed this agreement which severed Singapore from Malaysia, it will be a moment of anguish. For me, it is a moment of anguish because all my life, you see, the whole of my adult life, I have believed in merger and the unity of these two territories. You know, it's a people, connected by geography, economics, and ties of kinship. Would you mind if we stopped for a while? The recording was then stopped so the new Prime Minister could give some time to compose himself before he carried on with his speech. And no, I'm not making that up, that is exactly what it says in the minutes of the speech he said. This happened in 1965. 56 years later, we know Singapore as a very, very different place. A country of great wealth and is comparatively even more different to their neighbours who expelled them not so long ago. Lee Kuan Yew would be the Prime Minister from 1965 all the way to 1990, a long rule for a newly sovereign country. He implemented policies which aimed to promote the financial sector, cut out a lot of corruption in government, and encouraged a booming developmental and technological sector, resulting in opportunities and living conditions unseen from the neighbouring countries in Southeast Asia. So, as a result of all of these decisions and all of these different trials and tribulations that they faced, Singapore is now considered one of the richest countries per capita in the world, which is insane, and it kind of explains, I suppose, the stark differences between the rest of Malaysia and Singapore as a whole. Hindsight's a funny thing, and it's really strange to look back and see why these things happened and where we are today. I mean, with all the things we discussed previously, it kind of makes sense at the end of the day. If you liked the video, be sure to like and subscribe. If you want to be notified as soon as I upload my next video, be sure to hit the bell button. And if you've got any ideas for what topics you'd like me to discuss next, let me know down in the comments below. As always, sources used in the video will be in the description. Don't worry, Singapore, your independence has not come in vain. When I'm the supreme ruler of my own country in the future, I'm pretty sure we can make a union of states, the Singapore Brain Spill Union. You might need to take the bill on a few things, however, as a developing country, we're going to need to rely on yourselves to hopefully pay for us, so we appreciate that. I'll see you guys in the next video. Fantastic.